Hey everybody, it's Greg. I really wish that I could be there with you all today to give this talk in person, but I'm pleased to say that I graduated from my program in December and have since left Washington, D.C. But at any rate, it's really great to reconnect with you all via satellite. It sounds a lot cooler when I say it that way, but I hope that you enjoy my talk and that you get something out of it, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end. What I'm here to talk to you about today is what I found particularly interesting over the course of my observations, and that is everyone's use of narrative or storytelling in the EML classroom. So, in the spirit of that, as well as in the spirit of how Anna just kicked things off for us with her story, for the next 10 minutes I'm going to tell you my story, the story of my findings, a story about a boy named Greg, who, from March to December of 2012, had the privilege and honor of coming to see in a very concrete and explicit way just how the stories you all told during class demonstrated the beginnings and expression of what I saw as your values as a community. March 14th, 2012. The EML8 opening residency. I'm sure you all remember this moment very well. It's the moment when you all became Georgetown students and started the EML program. It was when we first met. And for me, this was also when my ethnography of communication within the larger Talking Business project in the linguistics department began. Everyone on the project has been conducting their own ethnography of communication, which is a way of listening, a way of uncovering communicative norms within a particular context. And so, even though we all might focus in on a particular linguistic phenomenon, such as storytelling, we're all going to find something different because we've all been trained in different ways and we have different backgrounds. Over the course of the first month of listening, watching, and talking with you all, I took pages and pages of notes and consistently correlated with them with transcripts and recordings we had taken of the class sessions. Organizing these notes and observations took every bit of March and the beginning of April last year, especially considering the fact that transcription alone took about 5 minutes for every minute of recorded speech, and we were recording hour-long classes. Before long, however, I began to notice some class norms, practices that began to appear to me as commonplace for the EML8 cohort. In linguistics, we talk about norms using the terms unmarked and marked, where unmarked basically means the norm or the standard, and marked means the deviation, the thing that sticks out. In the EML8 classroom, perhaps the most important and most salient unmarked action that I noticed right from the get-go in March was the practice of multitasking. I noticed that it was unmarked for everyone to be multitasking while a speaker had the classroom floor, whether it's checking a phone or using a computer or an iPad. I saw that more often than not, when someone else was speaking, a given EMLer was not making eye contact with the speaker and was instead directing their gaze at another task. Now, this isn't to say that lack of eye gaze means you aren't listening. It did, however, make those marked instances when listeners would direct their eye gaze towards a speaker stand out quite a bit. Soon enough, what began as a miasma of various linguistic phenomena began to clear, and I began to see by about May or June that in those marked instances when people were directing their eye gaze at speakers, the speaker was telling a story of some sort. To me, that was what began to reveal the most about what I interpreted as that which you value in terms of communicating information. That as a class, a story containing important takeaway points trumps the rattling off of data any day. So I began to quantitatively represent what I was seeing, that a narrative is the means by which any given speaker in the class can get the audience to look up at them and away from their computers and whatnot while they were talking. Either using a narrative of their personal experience of something, a narrative about someone else's experience that they've come to know, or a hypothetical narrative about a possible event, the class seemed to negotiate factual validity through the particular narrative in which the takeaway point was embedded. So I categorized narratives into three groups. Personal narrative, characterized by the use of first-person I, such as I was working for Freddie Mac. An other narrative, the use of third-person he, she, or they, about someone else's experience. Or a hypothetical narrative, a story about an event that hasn't taken place yet, characterized by use of second-person you. So it stands to reason that if for the group, narrative seems to most effectively communicate a point, that listeners would cue into what sounds like a story, terminate their multitasking, and then direct their eye gaze to demonstrate a greater level of engagement with the speaker in comparison with the unmarked multitasking event. In 1972, sociolinguist William Labov observed 6 things to be true about how narratives are told based on a collection of stories he heard from people during interviews he conducted in New York City. He gleaned these 6 components to a narrative as characteristic parts of their stories, namely an abstract, so a summary about what the story is, an orientation, something describing who was involved, where it took place, etc., a complicating action or a description of the main event, an evaluation about that event, so how the storyteller personally orients to that event, the resolution of that event, and then finally a coda, the end, that's what happened. It isn't absolutely necessary to always have an abstract or a coda, but by and large, all of the other parts are usually present in a narrative. Thus, it would stand to reason that if we heard any one of these particular speech features during class, that it would cue our attention that a narrative was being told. If we heard a description about a place in the orientation, or if we heard a description about the story that was coming in the abstract, this would signal to us that a narrative was coming. And so therefore, in this way, EML listeners could systematically assess whether or not to terminate their multitasking based on whether or not they heard any one of these particular parts of a narrative. So now you have a little bit of an idea as to what I was thinking about when it came to my observations last year. I was interested in what sounds like a story and at what point do people start looking at the speaker when they're telling one, and how often did they do it. So I started trying to think up ways to try and quantify the power of narrative in the EML classroom as I had been seeing it. Something to make what I was intuitively observing more concrete. So after I developed my coding scheme that outlined types of narratives, personal narrative, hypothetical narrative, etc., I began to pilot a method for doing exactly this, counting when people told narratives and comparing how many people were watching when someone was telling a story versus when someone was not. Every time someone told a story in class, I would take an immediate inventory of audience members who were directing their eye gaze towards the speaker instead of multitasking. I called this viewership, a display of listenership via eye gaze that exhibits more than the normal or the unmarked level of displaying involvement, which was multitasking. So in this way, I was able to quantify the salience of storytelling in the EML classroom. Here in this slide, indicated in red, we see that the use of narrative significantly correlates with higher viewership. I put arrows next to the highest and the lowest percentages of viewership throughout the Creating and Changing Cultures class. I specifically chose to pilot my quantitative coding scheme on this class because I wanted an environment where there was one speaker who had the opportunity to tell a story during his or her presentation, while everybody else in the audience was set as listeners. And what I found was that overwhelmingly, the use of narrative corresponded to more people directing their eye gaze toward the storyteller. So you'll see in row 1 with Terry, she didn't tell a narrative. She just presented strictly theoretical talk indicated by the gray boxes. And if you look all the way over to the far right-hand column, you'll see that viewership was 49%. Only 9 of the 22 people in the class were watching. But if you look starting with line 5, Brianna had a viewership of 55% as she started her presentation with a personal narrative. Steadily, her percentage of viewership increased, peaking at 85% in line 8 by telling other narratives, stories about other people. The same was the case with Jody and Ellie when they kicked off their presentation with a hypothetical narrative. They had 90.9% viewership, and then in moving to the other narrative, they increased to 95.5% viewership in row 13. Finally, with Oren's presentation, he steadily increased his viewership from 40.9% to 77.3% in row 18 in telling other narratives as well. So here you can just sort of start to see in numbers just how salient the power of narrative in the EML classroom appeared to me during my observations. So really quickly approaching the end of my talk, I just want to show you what one of these high viewership instances looks like. Specifically, I'm going to focus in on row 19 when Oren told a personal narrative and it resulted in a viewership of 77.3%. So the following is an excerpt from a presentation that Oren made, who is the head of human resources at his company, Regolith. Oren opted to conduct a case study analysis of his department at work for the class assignment, and in this transcript, he introduces the history of the company's success, but he does this by embedding the facts about Regolith, the company, within an evaluative personal narrative. Here I've highlighted all of the Labovian parts of the narrative in different colors. So you have the abstract in blue, the orientation in green, the complicating action in purple, and so forth. But specifically in red, you see the parts that are facts. And what you can see here in this overall transcript is that the facts are embedded inside of the narrative framework. This shows the difficulties that Regolith experienced as a company from Oren's personal point of view as the HR rep. So as you can see here in the overall narrative outlined in this transcript, the facts are inserted directly in the middle of a larger narrative schematic, which is what I interpreted as the contributing factor for his high viewership during his presentation. Now this brings us to March 1st, 2013. All of these observations and analyses have culminated in this presentation that you now see before you, and just as I've now joined the ranks of other EMLers who Skype into class, I'm now taking on new and exciting experiences in my ethnography of communication with you all. I've finally had the opportunity to share with you a story of mine in hopes of communicating information that I found important. The process is ongoing, where each new angle on my participation in the cohort as a community provides me a new means of insight as to what characteristics about the way you talk says something about what you all value as a group in terms of information. I hope that some of what I've said today has resonated with you all in regards to the power of storytelling and narrative in the EML classroom context, and I thank you very much for welcoming me so warmly into your community. Thank you for your openness, and thank you for your stories, and I look forward to hearing many more.